Hello everyone, and welcome back to the farm. I'm Bree here with Blossom and Branch Farm, and today we're going to be talking about tulips and why I am boycotting them. Not really boycotting them, I'm just no longer growing them. And here's why. I'm not going to bury the lead in this video. I'm going to tell you the most important reason why I'm not growing tulips this year first. So in the past, we have grown anywhere from 1,000 to 7,000 tulips. So we've done this a lot. Over the last 5 years, we've grown them each year, and as we've done that, we've learned several things. The major reason has nothing to do with our growing conditions or the midnight, get out here. So we've grown a lot of tulips, is what I'm trying to say, over the years, and so part of why we're not growing them has to do with some growing conditions and some other tricky things that have to do with profitability and those kinds of things. But really the main reason why we're not growing tulips this year has to do with fungicide treatments. Specifically fungicide treatments where the bulbs are grown, mostly in the Netherlands, is where most of our bulbs here in the US come from. There are maybe a couple smaller US producers, but for the most part, even growers that are selling them here are usually importing them from the Netherlands and then reselling them. It's just where most of them come from. They have the right climate, they have damp, cool winters, and they have warm, dry summers. Those are good growing conditions for tulips. So this is all well and good that this is where they're produced. The problem is, anytime we have a monoculture, and we talked about this in our dahlia video, anytime we have a monoculture or one type of plant growing in a huge expansive space, so a monoculture, like all tulips, right? We've all seen videos of the fields of tulips. And what happens is, that's when we start getting diseases. Same thing in our home garden. If we grow a lot of one type of thing in one area, that's when we tend to get diseases, especially when we do it year over year over year. This is why we rotate crops in the garden. It's why we incorporate biodiversity practices so that we don't get those diseases and funguses. That's not really possible for the tulip growers. They cram their space full of tulips and disease happens. So what has happened with this disease issue? Well, there are 4 fungicides basically that can be used against funguses. And these funguses not only infect plants and animals, they infect humans as well. One of the diseases that tulips are really prone to is called tulip fire. It's a type of botrytis, and it can happen in damp conditions. It spreads very rapidly once it's in the soil. It's there for at least 3 years. If you have tulips planted in there every year and you had tulip fire the previous years, those tulips will get tulip fire. Now 3 years ago, all of our tulips had tulip fire, and those tulips were from a supplier I won't specifically name, but it rhymed with Schmid and Frothers. They all had tulip fire. So when they come up in the spring and they have tulip fire, they'll get kind of curly and twisted. The blooms will come up small and stunted, and they won't really ever open. They kind of just wither on the plant if they come up at all. So 3 years ago, we had a total loss on our tulips because of tulip fire. So with this tulip fire, the growers in the Netherlands use a group of fungicides called azoles. This fungicide targets tulip fire. Sounds all well and good, right? They're controlling this fungus with this fungicide. Well, overuse of anything, right, is never a good thing, and especially true with fungicides. We've all probably heard of antibiotic resistance and prescribing and using too many antibiotics leading to antibiotic resistance. Same thing can happen with fungicides. So in the Netherlands, there have been several reports of people around these tulip growing areas who develop this fungus, and they're normal, healthy people. They're not elderly, they're not particularly sick or immunocompromised, but they get ill with a fungus and the fungicide fails. They don't react to the fungicide. And so they die. And it's a really serious problem. I'll link the article below about it. So basically what you need to know is this. Most of the tulips that you're going to be getting, if they're at the big box store, if you're ordering them from any major supplier, wherever you're getting them, even if you're ordering them from a flower farmer here in the States, I'm sorry to say, a lot of times they are just reselling bulbs that they have purchased in the Netherlands. We sold daffodils this year that we had dug up from our own beds that have been here for 5 years. So those ones are safe. So if a farmer has dug them up and grown them themselves, and you know that they didn't have tulip fire and they haven't used excessive fungicide, those are ones that I would feel comfortable buying, but those are really, really hard to come by. So because of the difficulty in even sourcing any tulips that haven't been doused with fungicides that I don't want in my soil or are supporting this overuse of fungicide that's happening, I'm just not going to do it. I'm not buying it anymore. I'm not supporting it anymore. I'm just not doing it. That being said, there are other reasons why I'm not growing tulips that really have more to do with profitability as a flower farmer. I'll get to that at the end, and really growing conditions. So let's talk about the growing conditions that tulips like. They like chill time in the winter. So usually they like around 16 weeks of around, maybe a little bit above freezing temperatures in the soil. So if they don't get that time, they're not going to bloom, which is why they don't really do that well in southern climates or warmer climates. They're really a cool climate plant. That being said, with our winters, with our winter temperature variability, sometimes we will warm up in January to 60, 70 degrees. The soil warms, it kind of freaks out the tulips. They're not getting their right amount of chill hours. And so we've had years where our tulips just didn't look that great because they didn't get the chill hours that they needed. Now they might still bloom, but they're small, they're short. The other issue is with those temperature variabilities, especially in the spring. So once the tulips come up for us and they start to grow, they usually need a lot of water, and our springs have inconsistent water. We don't always get rain, we don't always get snow. Last year we had 2 months in the spring where we got no precipitation, so we had to be out here watering, but we were still getting freezes. So we'd have to water everything and then blow out all of our hoses. And the year before that, in May, when our tulips were just getting ready to open, we got a 90-degree temperature week, and all of our tulips suddenly blew open, and we didn't have time to harvest them all. We only got a percentage of them harvested before they blew open. They had short stems because it was too hot for them. It was just, we've had, every year, there has been something. That being said, last year was actually a good tulip year because we had a cold winter, we had a wet winter, we had a wet spring, but that is not the norm for us, and that leads me into profitability. So the last reason why I am not growing tulips anymore has to do with the profitability. For me as a flower farmer, we grow tulips as annuals. This is probably true for most of you as home gardeners. Now there are varieties that will perennialize in tulips, such as the Darwin varieties. Some of those are more likely to perennialize. However, they're not really the colors that I like. I'm sorry to be picky, but the Darwin variety of tulips are my favorite. They don't really stand out like the fancier tulips that we used to grow, the peonies, the double ruffled tulips. And we'll talk about this when we get to profitability, but that does impact our ability to sell them. But if you want a tulip that's going to possibly perennialize, go for the Darwins. Otherwise, all the fancy ones that we grow here are annuals. We pull them up from the bulb in the spring, we compost, we cut off the bulb and toss the bulb, and we have to clean off the flower. It's a whole process, and it's very time consuming to harvest tulips because of that process. So just to clarify, it's not because I didn't just cut the tulips off and leave them in the ground. Even if we had cut them and left them in the ground, they are unlikely to perennialize and rebloom in the second year. They might a little bit in the second year, but not considering how much space they take up. The blooms are very sparse in years 2 and 3 for the fancy tulips that do well here. And when I say do well, let's talk about profitability. So all of this leading into, yes, there are some, more generic tulips that I could grow, like the Darwin varieties. But even if I grow those ones, I have a very hard time selling them because the market is usually flooded with tulips in the spring. Okay, so you could go to the grocery store and you can get a bunch of 10 to 12 tulips for under $10. Frankly, I just can't compete with that. Even if they're perennial flowers and I'm not having to replant them every year, they're taking up bed space. Harvesting them is still a pain because they come out covered in dirt. We have to make sure we're getting the stem length. We still have to make sure we're watering them. And if we're going to let them perennialize, the tulips need a space in the summer that is going to be dry. They don't like to be wet over the summer or else they can rot. So we have to keep that bed pretty dry in the summer. So they eat up a whole bed and we only get a few blooms in the spring. And quite frankly, I can't compete with the grocery store prices for a cut flower. I just can't. I can't compete with 80 to 90 cents per bloom. It's just not a number that I'm willing to harvest and wrap up a bouquet and deal with retail for. It's just too much work for that. So, not to be a Debbie Downer, but I always want you guys to have all of the information that you can so that you can make the most informed decision about whether you are going to grow something or not. Now, this kind of does lead me into what are we growing in place of our normal spring tulips, and there are two things. One is stock. Our stock did really well this year. I was really happy with how our stock did. We started that stock around January, and we planted it out pretty early in the spring under a very light cover just to help keep the ground from freezing. But the stock did really, really well, and we're still growing daffodils, of course, and then we have peonies. But daffodils, at least in my area, the deer don't eat them. So if you have deer, that's another downside of growing tulips, is they usually love tulips. The deer don't like daffodils. Daffodils perennialize in my zone, which just makes them more low maintenance overall. So I guess that's it. I just wanted to talk to you guys today about why I'm not growing tulips and give you some things to think about. If you liked this video, please remember to like, subscribe, follow, all those things. It helps us out a lot here at the farm, and it really actually does. So we appreciate you guys. See you around here next time.